And welcome back to our last session of the day. Sorry for this very, very short break. We hope that it was enough for you to be awake for this last session. We now welcome our last plenary speaker of the day, Dr. Kristal Cain from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Kristal got her PhD from Indiana University, working on the evolution of sex differences in a common sparrow, the dark-eyed junco. She then crossed the ocean to reach Australia to undertake several postdoctoral positions, exploring the song in fairy wrens and the role of hormones in Gouldian finch behavior. She is now a senior lecturer in ecology, evolution, and genetics at the University of Auckland. Using songbirds as models, Kristal and her team use a wide range of approaches to explore behavioral and physiological mechanisms underlying behavioral flexibility and the evolution of complex social traits, including communication. Today, she will give a presentation, The Art of Song, exploring the origins of vocal learning. Thanks, Kristal, for joining us and for accepting our invitation. We are very excited about hearing your presentation today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alexei. And tēnā koutou, ko Kristal for Kristal Ingoa. And so I'm going to start by acknowledging that there are probably two different types of people in the audience. First, a lot of you, hopefully, if you're awake, are non-bird people. And I'd like to really thank you for being here. I'm fully aware that you're probably registered for this conference because you're interested in tracking technologies or Boris or fig wasps or any of the millions of other things that make up the field of animal behavior. And you might even be a little bit annoyed with birdsong because it so dominates the study of animal behavior. And it has for a long time. We study it in every context you can possibly imagine, from sexual selection to neurobiology, cognition, hormonal mechanisms. I could go on and on. So you're forgiven for being a bit over it sometimes, but don't worry, I'm going to come at it from a slightly different angle today. And so hopefully that'll help you enjoy it. And for the birdos and the song nerds that are in the audience, I'm going to apologize. I'm not really going to talk much about tutors or frequency modulation or mate choice. And I might only mention spectral cross-correlation in passing. But I'm going to focus today on some of the research approaches I've been using for the past years and kind of try to identify some of the gaps and opportunities we've found along the way. The most important thing I want you to take away from this is that you shouldn't be afraid to question what is known, and I put that in quotation marks, and also not afraid to ask questions that no one's thought to ask yet. So all sorts of animals use acoustic communication to get their message across, no matter just about any species you can think of. They use some form of acoustic communication. But most animals are born knowing how to do that, right? A frog can ribbit without ever hearing or seeing another frog. And pretty much every gull you've ever met in your life will scream mine at you, whether it's ever heard another gull scream mine. Now, humans are a little bit different because although we're born knowing how to make some noises, as any parent that's in the audience will be fully aware, newborns are quite capable of making a lot of noise without learning. We have another trick up our sleeve, right? We're able to vocally learn. So we listen to the vocalizations from the adults around us, and we learn languages, and we learn accents, and we can learn to beatbox. We can learn to throat sing, right? All of this is attributable to the fact that we are vocal learners. And it's one of the main reasons that folks get so excited about birdsong is that birdsong is so similar to human speech and language. Songbirds have a remarkable number of parallels to human language and speech. And as humans, we're obsessed with ourselves. So we're interested in any animal that has parallels to ourselves. Songbirds will go through very pronounced vocal development stages, much in the same way a toddler does. They even have a babbling phrase where they're trying out a whole bunch of different noises before they figure out how to make adult noises. They have analogous brain regions to what we have, similar neural sites, and even patterns of gene expression during learning that mirror some of our own. So they're really important models for human health and development. And importantly, songbirds are a lot more tractable as study subjects than the other well-established vocal learners, like the whales and dolphins. I'm not ever going to say that birds are easy. I fully think that birds are often jerks. But rearing 50 songbirds in a cage is a lot more feasible than trying to track 50 orca across their development period. And that's especially true if you need to be on a yacht in order to get close to the orca. So I, for one, welcome our new orca overlords. I don't know about you. Now, song is an interesting and important behavior, but I'm a behavioral ecologist, so I'm really interested in the evolutionary pressures and history behind that behavior. So I've titled this talk, Exploring the Heart of Song, to reflect that. And my goal today is to kind of tackle some of the core assumptions we have about the evolution of birdsong, and I'm talking specifically about learned birdsong here. And those assumptions are kind of wrapped up in who does it, why did they do it, when did it evolve, where did it evolve? And I'm going to spend most of my time talking about those questions. But because the world is a total mess and we're all kind of looking for things that we can do to make the world a better place, I'm going to talk just a little bit about how and whether or not we can use birds to kind of understand ourselves a little bit and maybe improve how we interact with the modern world a little bit. So if you're trying to understand any behavior, like I mentioned, you're going to want to understand the selective pressures that underlie it. And when I was taking ornithology as an undergrad, the science of birds, they told me that we already had answers to these questions. So some of the answers I got were that songbirds had evolved in the northern hemisphere, that songbirds had evolved in males, and in particular that it evolved for sexual selection purposes. It's used by males to compete with other males for access to territories or mates, or to advertise to females. And then females choose mates based on their songs. And then finally, we have this idea that song learning is a binary trait. It's meaning it's something you either have or you don't have. And at the time I was an undergrad, we were being taught that there's just a few groups that had this ability: humans, songbirds and parrots, and then the whales and elephants. Now, I'm talking about those sorts of kind of older assumptions and inherited wisdom because I think they've really shaped what sort of research we do and what questions we ask, what data is collected, and what types of things we pay attention to. So I'm going to start by kind of looking at some of those assumptions really closely. So first, are songbirds of the North, right? This is a kind of ingrained kind of idea that the songbirds evolved either in Northern Europe or in the Northern Hemisphere in general. But the data actually tells us the reverse. Rather than songbirds evolving in the north and then radiating to the rest of the planet, what you see is that the songbirds probably evolved in Gondwana land. They evolved in Australia, New Zealand, South America, and then radiated up through the rest of the world. And these birds that we've been studying for decades and decades to understand their song patterns, like the white-crowned sparrow, are actually part of this really recently evolved group. They're not an old species at all. The old species are things like the superb fairy wren, which is down there in Australia. And if you want to talk really old, then you need to look at the New Zealand wrens. And although they're both wrens, they're not related to each other at all. Bird people just love to name things wrens, and I'm not sure why. So right away, we see that there's some pretty basic assumptions about song learning that were really off base, right? They're coming from a totally different place than we thought they were coming from. Now, these two groups, the fairy wrens and the New Zealand wrens, are kind of going to be stars of the talk later, so keep them in mind. So this is a bird phylogeny. It's kind of a fancy one. I don't want you to get too bogged down by it. What you can see is here at around 3 o'clock, where the lyrebirds and the scrubbirds are, those are the oldest songbirds. And, just a little bit below that are our friends, the fairy wrens I mentioned before. And you have to go all the way around, almost back to 3 o'clock again, before you get to that white-crowned sparrow. So that's that really recently emerged species. Now, most of our song research is in that kind of group, in that recently evolved species group. But if you look around the perimeter of this big circle, you see all these dots that are red or blue. Now, those red dots are groups where the females sing. Those are the families where there's female song. And where there's blue dots, there's no female song. What you can see straight away if you start looking at this is there's a whole lot of red in that bottom half and even that top left half. And you don't get a lot of blue until you get to those really recently evolved species. And what that tells us is that because it's really prevalent throughout the older species and missing in the new species, is that female song is actually ancestral. It's the default state. And it's common in these older groups, and it's only rare in the new groups. What's even more interesting is that if you look at that pie chart is showing you the proportion of families that have female song versus those that don't. So not only is it ancestral, it's also really common. And so it's probably actually the norm. And the species we've been studying for a long time have probably lost their song. They're the unusual ones rather than the groups where the females sing. Now, that's not That's surprising probably to many of you, because outside of the Northern Hemisphere, in the global South and the equator, most females sing regularly. Both sexes of those species are known for female song, and there's even a few, like the cardinal and the house wren, where we know the females sing in the Northern Hemisphere. But there's loads of species that no one's even studied yet, so the prevalence of female song might be a lot more common in those other families. And now that we're looking for it, we're finding female song in a lot more species of those Northern Hemisphere birds. Even some of our most well-studied species, like the blue tit, we're only just now documenting female song in that group, even though we've been studying them for decades. It just turns out that female song has been overlooked because we didn't know to look for it. So to me, this means we were wrong about where they evolved. We were wrong about who it evolved in, and it's a lot more common than we previously thought. So in my mind, we've been thinking about song kind of from the wrong starting point, and we might have been asking some of the wrong questions. For instance, instead of asking why tropical females sing and duet, the real question is probably why those Northern Hemisphere species have lost song or lost it to a large extent. And so around here is when I started doing my own song research, and I was wondering, what else are we wrong about? Because it seems like we're not very good at this right now. And so I have a background, as Alexi introduced, in studying sex differences. And I'm really interested in studying female behavior. So of course, I was really interested in female song. And at the time, we had a lot of ideas about female song and why it existed. Some folks, even in some of the textbooks, it says that female song is due to a hormonal abnormality, which I found pretty entertaining. So while song might be modulated by hormones, I don't think we can really call it an abnormality when most of the species do it and it's just really super common, right? So I'm going to just cross that one out. But there are still a bunch of other ideas that were really prevalent. Most of them are around females using it to advertise fertility, or that it was a byproduct of selection on males. And so the idea there is that there's such strong selection on males to sing that females are kind of just being drug along for the ride. And then if we look at male patterns, the idea is that it's more elaborate as you move closer to the equator. So we should see female song getting more elaborate as we move closer to the equator as well. So to start with, we wanted to look and see whether or not they were really signaling fertility. And this is where I started my postdoc with Dr. Naomi Langmore. And what we did is basically just looked at female song across different breeding stages and just measured how much she's singing. If she's using it to signal her fertility, we should see the highest rates when she's pre-breeding or right before she has any young, and then a big drop once she's actually breeding and has young. But instead, what we see is females are pretty consistent across breeding stage. And if anything, we see them actually singing less before they start breeding, when we would predict them to be singing the most. So that's kind of suggesting to me that it's probably not fertility in this species. We also did what's called a simulated territorial intrusion, and that's where you kind of make the bird think that there's an intruder in their territory by playing some song. So we did this, and we measured both male and female song rates before and after the trial. If the females are using song to signal their fertility, we would predict that males would really respond to that because that's in the male's best interest. We wouldn't expect the females to really respond at all. But what we found was quite the reverse. The females were really kicking up their song rates, whereas the males were kind of, if anything, lessening their song rates. So there's no statistical difference there for male songs. And so that, again, is suggesting that fertility is probably not the main function for song in this particular species. Now, to kind of give you an idea of what this looks like in real life, I'm going to show you a little video. This is a different species of fairy wren. This is a red-backed fairy wren. And what has happened is we've tied a taxidermy female where this circle is. And then we're playing some song that hopefully you can hear, but if not, you can just imagine some generic bird song. And that little bird that just flew in, that's a female red-backed fairy wren. And she's immediately singing in response to this playback. Now, after a moment here, the male shows up as well because they respond to these intrusions in pairs often, but they're responding very differently. The male starts eventually basically trying to court this taxidermy female, but the female has very different ideas about that. She, instead of responding either by ignoring it or just singing in response to it, gets really quite violent. And so she's actually physically attacking them out here. And this is in slow motion, so you can really see it. And she's pecking at the eyes of the taxidermy male. she got to a point where she was actually dangling by one foot, but continuing to physically attack this taxidermy mount because she was so angry about this female in her territory. So to me, this isn't something that animals engage in really lightly. Like violence and fighting is a really expensive behavior. So that suggests to me that this intruder is a real threat to this female in some kind of way. So things get really interesting when you look at how song is related to success, because if this is a functional trait and this is actually a threat to the female, then we should see something happening with how successful females are. And sure enough, that's what I found. If you lumped all of the females as successful females, meaning they fledged any young at all in that particular season, or as a failed female, meaning every nesting attempt she had ended in failure, you can see a difference there in song rate. And if you plot a logistic regression through that, what you see is the females that sing the most are actually the most likely to have a successful nest. Now, we don't quite understand the mechanism between this. Maybe those females that sing a lot have better territories, or they have better mates, or they feed more, or they're better able to deter predators. But it does suggest that there's a functional relationship between a female's song rate and her ability to have offspring. And so that, again, suggests that it's not that females don't have a function for their song, or that they're just doing it because of males or for fertility. It's actually an important tool for females. And this kind of brings us to the next question, whereas if song is functional, if it's doing something, what is shaping variation in song or song complexity? We have a lot of ideas about how sexual selection shapes that, but we know that females often aren't as affected by mate competition, but more competition for other resources that are important for reproduction. So we wanted to know whether song complexity was shaped by life history or geography, and whether the forces that are shaping male and female song and the differences between male and female song are different. There's a lot of differences in there. And so I want to introduce you to the fairy wrens kind of as a larger group to explore this question. They're pretty well studied amongst behavior people because they're just gorgeous. I mean, if you look at these birds, all the males are pretty variable. They're pretty gorgeous. They're easy to catch. And they've been really well studied in terms of sexual selection because they're so elaborately plumaged. But the females are pretty variable as well. They range from that really brown, animated ball of dust on the left to kind of the more electric blue and white and the black and white that you see on your far right. And they live all over Australia and Papua New Guinea. So if you're interested in how habitat or ecology affects different social systems, mating systems, behaviors, they're really great species. But they're really, despite all that variation, they're really consistent in terms of their biology. They're all insectivorous, always the female building the nest, always the female being the primary caregiver. None of them migrate. So they're really useful. So what I did with Karen Odom and a bunch of other fairy wren biologists is we recorded birds from 15 different populations and 9 different species. And we got between 30 and 60 songs per sex per species. And the idea was we wanted to look at the variation between males and females, look at how song is evolving, look at what life history characteristics are kind of shaping these sorts of things. And overall, we found that female song is evolving quite independently of male song, but we weren't quite sure what was shaping it. And so if we look at a couple of life history variables, what we find is that if you look at song length, which is one measure of how complex a song is, and relate it to the proportion of provisioning, how much the male is feeding the offspring, you see that there's a negative relationship there. So basically what that means is songs get shorter as males contribute more to parental care. And the songs are getting more similar. So male and female songs get more similar as those sex roles get more similar. With male survival, we see a strong effect on male song length. So as he lives longer, his songs get shorter. But with females, it doesn't seem to really matter. So we're seeing that female song isn't shaped by that in the same way that male song is. If we look at other measures of complexity, like element rate and acoustic variability, we see some kind of interesting results here. So we've got breeding synchrony here, and the idea is that as if birds are breeding all at the same time, there's more intense competition. And so what you see is females' element rate goes higher as they get more synchronous, but male song isn't so affected by that. In contrast, acoustic variability has a stronger relationship in males with breeding synchrony than females. And I mentioned that song elaboration was predicted to get more complex as you move closer to the equator, but we found no relationship with how close the birds are to the equator and how elaborate their songs are. So that's completely different than what we see in other groups and in Northern Hemisphere species. And so this has led to a whole bunch of new ideas about female song, that it's more common, it's more ancestral, it's often just as complex and frequent as male song. It might be a fertility signal in some species or in some contexts, but in many cases it's not. It often seems to be a tool for resource defense that predicts female fitness in a couple different species where it's been studied. And importantly, it seems to be shaped by female ecology. It's not matching what's happening in the males. And so what we know about male song and male patterns doesn't always apply. So we really need to kind of go in and check a lot of our questions about that. And so the big picture takeaway, or the bigger picture takeaway there, is that we need research on a wider variety of species, and we need more research in places other than the Northern Hemisphere. It's starting to come in, and it's been really fantastic, and it's really changing the way we look at things. I just want to encourage any new scientists out there to keep doing that stuff. And I always think we need to look really closely at what we think we know, because every time we think we know something, but we don't test it, turns out we're often wrong about that. So I'm going to pivot a little bit and talk about when song learning evolved and in which species, because I think this kind of stuff is really fascinating as well, and also has some pretty inbuilt assumptions. So this is the bird family tree up into a few years ago. This is all birds, all 10,000 birds. And each of these dark circles here indicates a group that has vocal learning in it, where we know they're vocal learners. So you can see the oscines, which is a group of the songbirds, the hummingbirds, and the parrots. And in this really simplified tree, they're already pretty far apart from each other. And because they were really far apart, we all thought that these were three independent evolutionary origins of vocal learning. And we kind of based our research around that. But more recently, what happened, before I get into that, I want to point out that there's those New Zealand wrens, those really old ones I mentioned before, they're right there. So they're in that same group with sub-oscines, which are a type of songbird that at this point we thought weren't able to do any vocal learning. Now, fast forward to the last couple of years where we have this, this revolution in molecular DNA, and we're able to get really much higher resolution family trees. And now the bird family tree has kind of been completely upended and reshuffled. And the important changes here are twofold. One, the New Zealand wrens are kind of been pulled out, and they're basal to all of the passerines, right? They're in their own suborder now, and we don't know anything about their vocal learning. We also have the parrots have moved from really far away to now just below the songbirds, indicating that they now share a common ancestor. And this brings up a new alternative hypothesis that instead of three different unique evolutionary origins of vocal learning, what could have happened is in that light blue circle, that could have been the ancestor for parrots and songbirds, and it might have had some vocal learning abilities. And so now we see the New Zealand wrens in their own group, and new research has shown that there are at least a couple sub-oscine species that likely have vocal learning. And so that's really changing the equation. And if that's the case, and New Zealand wrens are able to vocal learn, that really sets the origin of vocal learning much further back in time and really changes a lot of our assumptions about how that works. Now that's the Titipuanamo. That's one of only two extant New Zealand wrens that still exist, and they only are found in New Zealand. So they're really special birds. And they're really fun because they're neither oscine or sub-oscine, but a secret third thing. So they're really a really fantastic species to do some research on. Just a bit of natural history about them. They're very tiny. They weigh about as much as 5 or 7 paper clips. There's some males and females and juveniles in that picture. This is some footage of a female coming in and out of a nest to feed her offspring. And that's just a centimeter or two crack in a tree that they've put a nest inside of. So they're really tiny little birds. For contrast and for interest, here's another common New Zealand species. This is the tui. It weighs between 60 and 120 paper clips. So it's easily 10 to 20 times the size of, and it's another passerine, the size of the Titipuanamo. So we're really interested in trying to figure out if Titipuanamo are able to vocally learn, because that would really open up the Pandora's box around when vocal learning evolved and whether or not it happened in the shared ancestor of the parrots and the songbirds. But the main two ways that you can figure out if a bird is a vocal learner are these. First, you have to raise it in either social isolation, where it never hears another bird, or you have to deafen it. And if it's a learner, what happens is they have an anomalous song where they don't sound like the adults from their normal population. But if it's a non-learner, like a chicken, it's able to cock-a-doodle-doo no problem because it doesn't need to learn from the adults around them. Now, the other way is you have to have a specialized forebrain nuclei. And so you have to euthanize birds and perfuse their brains so that you can do some morphology and see if they've got these specialized nuclei in their brains, whereas non-learners don't have those specialized nuclei. Now, both of these are really powerful methods, but neither one of them are really appropriate for this species because it's a tonga, it's a treasure for the island, and it's also declining and threatened. So it's not a species that we're going to be able to bring into the lab and do this kind of work to, or euthanize for doing neural studies. And so that left us kind of scratching our head and trying to figure out, well, how are we going to figure out if they're vocal learners or not if we can't bring them in captivity and we can't look at their brains? And so we thought about some of the other differences between learners and non-learners. And what we came up with was this. So in learners, because they're learning from the adults around them, and that tends to have drift, just like I sound different from someone that's from England or someone from Australia, even though we're all in theory speaking English, we have dialects. Whereas in non-learners, any variation that you see between vocalizations should be fairly mapped onto genetic differences, or at least developmental differences type thing. It shouldn't really relate to social environment so much. Also, as I mentioned early on in the talk, learners go through a longer development period and they have these pronounced stages where they babble or have sub-song, whereas non-learners have a shorter development period and they don't go through that. As soon as they're physically adult size, they should be expressing adult song. They don't have to learn those vocalizations. And then the final way is looking at phenotypic variance. So if you look at the variation between individuals and how a trait is determined in learning species, most of the differences should be driven by social aspects, social environment. Whereas if it's not a learner, we'd expect it to be genetically determined rather than socially determined. So we decided we would focus on these three things because we could do this in wild animals rather than in captive animals, and we wouldn't have to euthanize any of our birds. So we decided to focus on that, and I put together this fantastic research team, PhD students, and other people that were working on the project. And we were fortunate enough to get some funding from the Marsden Fund, which is New Zealand's big funding body, to do this research. And so to start with, let's look at the geographic variation. And so this was work done by Dr. Sarah Withers for her PhD. And what she did is she went across the North Island and recorded birds from all these different populations. Most of you probably aren't quite familiar with how big and how small New Zealand is, but these populations, to drive from say the red dot down to the yellow, it would take 12 hours. So they're pretty far apart from each other, but we're not talking on the scale of days. And then what she did is she kind of used principal component analysis to cluster the different populations onto some different axes. And what you'd predict is the ones that are closest geographically are also close genetically, and they should be close acoustically. But we don't really find that. So if you look at the blue and the purple here, they're actually quite far away geographically. That's a huge distance for a bird that weighs 5 paperclips and doesn't really disperse as far as we're aware. But if we look at the PCA plot, what we find is they're really close acoustically, both on PC1 and PC2. So they're quite tightly linked. Now, in contrast, if you look at these populations that are in the middle of the island, they're all quite close geographically and genetically. And if you look at where they are on the principal component analysis, at least on principle 2, they're quite spread apart. So we're seeing that geographic variation, genetic variation, and acoustic variation aren't really mapping onto each other in as tight a pattern as we would predict if it is a non-learner, if it is totally genetically determined. So that gives us one bit of data. So now we wanted to look to see whether or not Titipuanemu match learner development patterns, whether they have longer periods and clear stages. And to do this, Yin-Yi Liu did a bunch of work where she put a passive acoustic recorders on the nest. And this was a huge amount of work because this is what Titipuanemu nests look like. So that's a crack in the bark. That's just a hole in the tree. That is a hole under a branch on the ground. So Titiponamu would just nest just about anywhere they can find a spot. And so it took a lot of work just to find the nest. And then what she did is looked at different parameters and how those related to different development stages. And she found that rather than these gradual changes or as it moves from a nestling to an adult, we're seeing quite big variation that seems to be quite distinct from each other. So it looks like there are these stages where the birds are developing their vocalizations. And it took about 6 months for them to go from making nestling noises to making adult noises. We'll talk more about what that means in a moment. We couldn't pinpoint it exactly because the time period that we were trying to do that turned out to coincide with the first COVID lockdown. So thanks, COVID, for ruining that. But Yin did a great job anyway. But we were seeing these clear stages, and Yin also identified a new note that no one had described before that only the juveniles do. And it seems to be that they're overproducing their vocalizations and then reducing those back down to what an adult vocalization is. This might be a type of babbling or subsong, we're not really sure. But we're still trying to figure out what that is. But it is very interesting to see that pattern. So how does that pattern actually fit with what we see with learners and non-learners? Does that kind of put them more on one end of the spectrum or the other? Well, it turns out it's not so simple as that. So you can read in a textbook that vocal learners have a protracted, development period, but when you actually go to look at the data, it's not so simple. So this is basically just an array of all the different studies that have looked at bird development periods. What you'll notice is there's a lot of empty squares and a lot of ones and twos. You'll also notice that there's a whole bunch right there in that basal passer day, and those are the ones I was mentioning earlier that are that really recently evolved group. But we found that almost, over a third of the total number of studies were done on only 2 different species. So there's some really strong bias in what we know. And a quarter of the studies were done only in North America. Only 5% of them included females at all, and only 2 were on subaucenes. And that's that really important group that is in the songbirds, but we think are non-learners. So we're just assuming based on those 2 studies that the rest of the birds don't learn. And only 2 studies were actually on non-learners. So if you're trying to compare learners and non-learners, that's not a lot of data to try to figure that out. But what Yin did is put all of the species on this graph, and it's full of lots of information, but all I want you to focus on are the purple spots, because those purple spots are where the birds actually are expressing their adult vocalizations. And for a frame of reference, I put a zebrafinch on there so you can see how old a zebrafinch is when it has adult vocalizations. And this mark right here is the 1-year mark. So you can see that anything past that would be those further things are actual post-hatch years. So let's put some other birds on this so you can kind of get an idea on what the variation is. So this is one type of white-crowned sparrow, our friend that we talked about earlier, but a different subspecies of white-crowned sparrow actually has a vocal learning development period of, much, much shorter. They crystallize their song very early in life, even before the zebrafinch does. This is a New Zealand bellbird. It's an open-ended learner, meaning it can learn all through its lifespan, but that's about the point that it's able to crystallize and produce adult vocalizations. Now, this is a 3-wattled bellbird. This is a subaucene. This is a completely different group. They're not supposed to be learners, but here we see this bird needing years before it can produce adult vocalizations, even though it's adult size much sooner. So where does the titipuana move? Oh, I forgot one more. Here's one of the only non-vocal learners, non-aucenes or parrots that we've actually got measurements for. This is a pied avocet, and it, despite being a non-learner, has a pretty long development period before it's able to produce its adult sounds. Now, the titipuana would fit right about here. Like I mentioned, we don't have an exact measurement for it, but that gives you a rough idea. So what shapes a trait or a song? We know that traits and songs are shaped by both genetics and environment and kind of the interaction between the 2 of those things. But if you're a learner, a big part is your environment, right? You can be shaped by parental effects, you can be shaped by competition or predation, but your social environment is how you learn, and that's what's going to really affect your song. So what we thought we would do is do a cross-fostering experience, because those are really, really powerful for disentangling social effects and genetic effects. And so we built 120 boxes, and put those out into the forest for the birds to use. We know they use them in other populations. Guess how many these birds used? And this is where I talk about tiny birds being jerks. They used 2 of my 120 boxes. So that meant cross-fostering was off the table. We weren't able to cross-foster the birds in the way we wanted to. Yeah, so even tiny birds are cute and jerky. So we had to do something else. So if we think about, there's an approach called quantitative genetics that allows you to partition phenotypic variation into genetics, environment, and of course, there's always a third category of some unexplained amount that could be because of other causes or just because we have a lot of error. And you can split up the variance into these different groups, and that can tell you how important social environment is relative to the genetics. In zebra finches, the only other species where someone's used this particular approach, you can see that the learned calls, which are here, have a much larger proportion of this dark blue, which is the social environment, whereas the innate call here has a much larger proportion of green and a very small proportion of the dark blue. So the innate call is much more heavily influenced by genetics, and the learned song and learned call are influenced by genetics. But importantly, different parameters show different patterns. So you have to measure a bunch of different parameters for that. So Innes did this work, and what she did is she recorded a bunch of adults and used that spectral cross correlation I told you I would mention to measure acoustic similarity. We also measured genetic similarity using SNP data. And then we used territory mapping to figure out how socially close these birds are to each other in our habitat. And then we use these to create trees, basically relatedness trees for all of them. With that data, what we were able to do is compare acoustic similarity to genetic similarity. And as you can see there, there's just no relationship. Most of our birds were not particularly closely related to each other, but even on the birds that were closely related to each other, there didn't seem to be a strong pattern between acoustic similarity and genetic similarity. Now contrast that with what we see when we look at acoustic similarity and social proximity. Now, for this particular graph, we've removed all those very related animals. So all the brothers and sisters and fathers and sons and all that have been pulled out of this. And here what you see instead is that social proximity and acoustic similarity have a very weak but positive relationship with each other. So birds that are closer in proximity are also more similar to each other. And so if we plot that against the zebrafinch, we see that for frequency modulation, strongly socially determined, for this call, also strongly socially determined and a bit more genetically determined. Important caveat here is because we weren't able to do cross-fostering, we can't really compare this directly to the zebrafinch. I'm just trying to give you a visual kind of comparison. This does tell us that social environment is hugely important for shaping these song parameters or call parameters, but don't read too much into the one-to-one number comparison between that and zebrafinch. So if we go back to our original table and look at these results and how they fit in, we see that variation was not really mapping onto genetics or geography for us. We see that the Titipuanmu had long development and potential sub-song when we think about that multi-note, and that social environment was really playing an important role in these parameters for at least some of them, more so than the genetics. So our Titipuanmu learners, well, the jury's still out on that. We need a lot more data on acquisition across life, on vocal development and other non-Auceans, and more data on that phenotypic variance that we did there at the very end with other species, so we can see how Titipuanmu compare to them. But the most important thing that I think we took away from this is that vocal learning is not so simple as yes or no. It's a really complex trait. And as people are looking at more and more species, they're starting to see that this is the case, that, you know, goats are able to vocally converge and mole rats seem to be able to change the vocalizations. And you see seeing this in more and more species, even ducks. There's this evidence that a duck can actually impersonate a person, which would be really crazy. But so we're still trying to shape that up. And even more recently, we've gotten some data that our closer relatives might have some kind of elements of vocal learning. And that can be really exciting because that could help us better understand our own abilities and how they evolved. So what this is suggesting is that rather than vocal learning is a binary yes or no trait, it's probably more like there's a continuum. And so you've got a lot of non-learners that aren't able to really do much at all. You've got parrots and humans on the other end that are able to do incredible amounts of vocal learning. And then other species somewhere along that spectrum where they've picked up some skills, but not the others. And if I had to put Tutuponimo on this graph, I'd put it here in this limited but rudimentary vocal learning ability. But there's still a lot we have to figure out about that. But what this means is that if New Zealand wrens are able to do a little bit of vocal learning, that common ancestor between the Aussians and the parrots was probably a vocal learner themselves, and that means vocal learning evolved a much longer time ago than we really realized. Yep. And again, the bigger takeaway for this is we need more species, we need different places, and we need to question what we think we know. And don't be afraid to try something different if what you had planned doesn't work, because research is always a moving feast. And so I'm going to spend just these last few minutes talking about this final project that Julie Garavagi Musoe has been working on about whether sleep deprivation affects bird vocalizations. And we're interested in this because all of us have felt this before, where we're just not getting enough sleep. And we know that sleep affects us, right? It makes it difficult to concentrate and impairs our memory. It has low work performance and cognitive decline. But we're not the only animals that sleep. All animals that have been studied show some kind of sleeping, different hours, different patterns, but they are all sleeping. And for all the species that have been studied, it's really important for a lot of those same things: memory, learning, cognition, and communication. Now, birds are affected by a lot of the same sleep disturbances we are, and then add on migration and breeding and predators. So this is something birds have to deal with in the real life. So given that birds have all these similarities between us and how they vocalize and how they learn, we wanted to know whether sleep is affecting bird communication. I'm going to go a bit fast here because I'm running out of time, but Julie did something similar to what Yen did, where she kind of looked at where we think sleep might affect birds. And we looked at the different kinds of vocal learners. So the chicken's a non-learner, a zebrafinch learns for a short period of time and then is done. And then the Australian magpie at the bottom, it learns all through its life. So we made predictions, and that's what those tick marks are, about whether or not we think sleep will affect those aspects of vocal performance or vocal learning, both in juveniles, and that's the jay, and adults. And what you can see is we predict it's going to affect a lot of different things in most species. But when you look at the number of studies that have been done, again, you're seeing a lot of empty boxes there. There's one study that's looked at how zebrafinches sing while they're learning, but it didn't disrupt their sleep. It just looked at whether or not they sing better after sleep or before sleep. And then this one study looking at open-ended learners was Julie's work. So what she did is she measured birds' song on a normal day, both in magpies and in common myna. Then we had days where we kept the bird up overnight, either by our presence, light at night, noise at night. And then we measured them the following day. And so we recorded their song on all three of these days and looked at how song changed. So in the magpie, you can see that the number of songs dramatically is reduced the day after we've kept them awake overnight. And even 24 hours later, when they've had a full night of sleep, they're still not singing as much. They're also singing at different times of day. That left graph shows you how birds usually sing. They sing a lot in the morning and a lot in the evening and are kind of quiescent in the afternoon. But after they've been sleep deprived, they sleep a lot more. They sing a lot more in the middle of the day and less in the morning and the afternoon. And they're still recovering that following day. We see similar patterns in the myna, but here's syllable rate. So this is not only reducing song numbers, but the complexity of the song. And much like we saw in the magpie, when they're calling, so calling is different than song. It's not a learned behavior, but it's still changing the number of calls that they're doing. So they're increasing the number of calls, which might suggest that they're trying to communicate more with the group. So there's a lot of different things Julie did with this, including looking at the role of hormones and the quality of sleep that I don't have time to get into today. But future research, we're wanting to look at chronic effects rather than just one night and these fitness consequences of this, and then whether or not it has these effects on vocal learning, because we know that vocal learning periods are really sensitive times. And so we just got a new grant on this topic. So I just wanted to give a thanks to the Royal Society of New Zealand for Marsden to work on that. And then I'll end by thanking my group. We've got a fantastic group of people that have done a lot of this work. I, of course, just get to be the head that speaks and kind of shows how great they are. And then finally, I'm going to, thank a bunch of our funding sources that have been able to do this work. And given it's about that time, I'll go ahead and say thank you very much for your time and for being here. And hopefully you're still awake. And I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Kristal. We are all awake. Thanks for this fascinating talk. While waiting for some question in the chat, I will start with one. That is regarding the very last part that you presented about sleep deprivation. I was wondering, when you are making the sleep deprivation, if the bird actually sing during the night.
They don't usually sing at night. We have when we're doing the actual deprivation, we have the lights off, so the birds don't see any light. And because the myna and the magpie both were wild caught birds, just our presence in the room was enough to keep them from being relaxed enough to sleep. They do vocalize a little bit, but very little compared to what they would do during the day.
Okay, because what I was wondering is that how much for it, because I did not see it in your hypothesis, but how much this the decrease of vocalization after sleep deprivation could be, for instance, due to an inflammation of the syrinx. I don't know if I say it properly.
Oh, yeah,
something like this. And that's why I was asking if maybe just because they are using it more and they are tired somehow.
No, that's a really interesting question. Yeah. No, they weren't really using it through the night. And we were initially worried that the birds were stressed. And so if they were stressed, maybe their corticosterone levels would up, and that might have an effect on their singing behavior. So to kind of tease those things apart, Julie did another experiment where she experimentally elevated the corticosterone in the birds by feeding them mealworms that had it injected. And she actually found that rather than suppressing song, when we did that, they increased their amount of song. So we couldn't measure their syrinx inflammation or anything like that, but I don't think that would be the case just because they didn't sing very much. We're also doing something where we're measuring how much they nap the next day, because maybe some of those changes in how much they're singing is just because they're spending more of the day sleeping than they usually would, trying to catch up on their missed sleep. So we're working on that currently.
Okay, interesting. So we received some question in the chat. So the first one from Laure Cochin, who first say thanks for this nice presentation. So the question is that, do females learn songs the same way as males? Thus, either during the development and then they can't learn anymore, or during development and then as adults they can still improve?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And the answer is we really don't know. There's only been a handful of studies where they've actually looked at female song development, and they don't really know who their females are learning from and what their learning periods are. So I can think of maybe 3 studies where we've really looked at female vocal development. There's a fantastic paper by Katarina Rybel, who's kind of called for changes in how we study vocal development behavior in birds to include that kind of information, because it's really an open question and you can make some alternative hypothesis about whether females are learning from their mom, whether they're learning from their father, and whether they're open-ended learners and learning throughout their life versus that short period of time. Probably depends on the species. That seems to be a species specific kind of thing. Like European starlings, they're open-ended learners and can learn through life. And we know that older females tend to sing more complicated songs than younger females. So that suggests that age is playing a role in that particular species, but it's a really understudied field. And so, yeah, there's a lot of opportunity for someone to contribute there.
Yeah, thanks for your answer. So we have Abby George, who say, so he's making reference of the last plenary of Gabriel, in which he talked about vocal complexity that is linked to social complexity. And Abby is asking if this is something you also see in songbirds, or is there too little variation in sociality to see any correlation?
Yeah, I think that's also a fantastic talk, a fantastic question. So I think that there probably is something going on with that. And we think that part of what happens with female song is they because a lot of the females that aren't in the northern hemisphere, they're more sedentary, they have more complex social relationships than the species that are migrating and just establishing short-term territories. That might be one of the strong motivators behind them retaining song. Whether or not song complexity is quite related to social complexity, I think, is a kind of an open topic. It definitely seems like vocal communication and the number of different call types is related to that. But I think call types and song complexity are two really different types of vocalizations. And I don't think we have a very good handle on how those two are related to each other. But I think if you look at things like meerkats that have really complex social organizations, and like the other plenary speaker was talking about, the subterranean rodents, they also have that. And compare that to some species where they live quite solitary and they have almost no vocalizations, there does seem to be a really strong pattern between that. But there's a big argument in the bird world right now about what is a song and what is a call, and are they different and how are they different? And I won't get into that because, yeah, it just gets chaotic.
Okay, so like still a lot to explore. So we have a second question from Laure Cochard. So like she's that is about the sleep deprivation. So like she's asking if it could be due to light pollution, for example, and in cities, and then if birds in cities would are particularly affected by this actually.
Yeah, I think that that's a really strong possibility. So we know that light at night is affecting bird vocalizations, and we know that noise in the cities is affecting bird vocalizations. But to a large extent, we don't really know how that's happening, what the mechanisms are underlying that. And so it's hugely possible that some of those consequences are because the birds aren't sleeping well at night, so they're not learning their more complex vocalizations. And so the songs that they're singing, like we know Tui, the large blackbird that I showed the one picture of, we know that they sing more complex songs in rural areas than urban areas. And it could very well be that light and noise at night is keeping them awake and keeping them from learning as well as their more rural counterparts. And so I think that that's still an open question that's going to be a little bit trickier to get at, because you're going to have to measure sleep quality in free living animals. But now, with some of this tracking technology that we've got, we're able to measure things like heart rate and movement, and you can put that on some of these rural and urban animals and kind of relate that to their singing later and kind of get at some of those questions.
Thanks for your answer. But actually, like we have another question that is related to this to pollution in cities, but this time noise pollution from Lupin Teles. With asking like with the problem of noise pollution, would it also be difficult for communication and by consequence for reproduction in some birds?
Yeah, definitely. We're seeing more and more research coming out that's showing that the kind of noise that we create with our cars and our machines and our heating and cooling and things like that is definitely impacting the birds, particularly birds that sing in lower frequencies where it overlaps with that kind of background noise. So we see birds having to sing at higher frequencies in order to deal with that. Sometimes those higher frequencies are not as attractive as the lower frequency songs. And so that could be really affecting mate choice. It could be affecting territoriality and how big of territories, because the noise is blocking some of the song transmission, so they're not able to defend as far. And I think it's having a lot bigger effects than we really realize, and we're just now kind of queuing into it. Like, people have started doing the research now and showing just about every time we've looked at it that it's having these big consequences for the animals. And whether that's affecting the young in the nest and their reproductive behavior is a whole other question.
And do you think that this increase of frequency of the sing, of volume of the sing, is due to a lack of self-perception due to the noise around, or if it's due really in purpose to make something louder in order to be heard by the other birds?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it's hard to kind of tease those two things apart, because all we can do, right, is measure how loud the noise is and how loud the bird is singing, and whether or not we can figure out whether the bird is intentionally raising that amplitude and that frequency to get out of the noise, or if they're having to do that so they can hear themselves. It is a tricky thing to figure out. I wish I could just ask the bird.
Yeah, that will be quite amazing. Actually, so I mean, like your talk focused mainly on the bird that are singing, but I
Mhm.
was a bit curious about this female in these species that are not singing at all. So, like your hypothesis is that certainly they lost the ability to sing along evolution.
Mhm.
And I was wondering if you or some other researcher already observed the apparition of a common communication feature to replace this
Mm.
song. So like, I mean, I will
Yeah.
say just a stupid example, but like a dance, like you see what I mean,
Yep.
just like another type of communication
Yep.
that surprisingly we would find in all these species that lost this feature of singing.
I don't think we've noticed anything to replace it. And in fact, I think what we've noticed more commonly is that as birds start migrating, what tends to happen is the females lose song and they lose color. And so rather than gaining a new communication channel, they seem to lose color and lose song. And so it's a little confusing to try to figure out why that is. Maybe migration is so costly that they can't afford to invest in color and invest in the brain regions that would be required to learn song. Or maybe it's because the benefits of having those things don't really pay off if you're only in a territory for a few months and there's plenty of food and there's plenty of mates and all of that stuff, which happens often with the migratory species more
Mhm.
so than sedentary species. So there's some really cool research that's been done by a couple of groups kind of looking at those relationships. And there are some species that are different, but a lot of times female color and female song change together. And females are acquiring song and losing song, or acquiring color and losing color at a faster rate than males are. So the males aren't changing nearly as much as the females are changing in most species. So that seems to be, but whether or not there's something else, like some kind of dance move, whether or not they're making some kind of like olfactory signal that is helping them, or something like that, I don't know. Not that I
Okay.
know of,
Oh,
but
that's
it's
interesting.
certainly possible.
That's interesting. At the end of the talk, like you started to talk a little bit about interspecies learning, but like in
Mm.
a limited number of group. Um, like I guess that there will be a limitation, as you say, in terms of storing the information and like how much you want to spend in. I mean, like how much it's worth it spending energy into developing the
Mm.
brain area in order to
Mm-hmm.
store information from other species.
Mm.
I guess we could expect that this kind of interspecies learning will more occur in between species that are occupying exactly the same area all the time, or
Mm.
what are you expecting regarding this?
Are you talking about species learning the song of other species?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I don't. You see that happen with mimics, and it's a little. I think we're still trying to figure why mimics really happen, where animals are imitating other species. Most of their explanations for that tend to be sexually selected oriented, like by mimicking a whole bunch of different species. The male is kind of showing off that he's got a big brain and can afford this energy. But we know that there are females that mimic, like we know female mockingbirds are mimics, and they'll sing from the nest. And probably the best examples of that would be female lyrebirds. The lyrebirds are famous for their ability to mimic things, and it's only in the last few years that people started researching the female mimicry. And the fascinating thing about that is the females are mimicking completely different species than the males are mimicking, and it seems like they're using that mimicry in completely different ways than the males are using it. And so that just opens up like a whole other bag of questions around
Hmm.
why are they choosing these species, and what are they using it for, and are they learning it in a different way than the males are learning it, and how they know to do that. Is pretty impressive. But yeah, I think having the brain power to store a bunch of different species or to keep learning throughout your life is a really expensive proposition. And so you have to think about like what the costs and benefits of that ability are. Yeah, in order to
Yeah, no,
acquire it and
completely.
maintain it. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we don't have more question. Thanks again,
No, my
Kristal, for
pleasure.
for it was really a nice talk, and thanks for like accepting our invitation and being with us today.
No, it's a fantastic opportunity. So I really hope everyone's enjoying it. It's a great conference.
So like if some people have more question, I think you are on the Discord, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so like do not hesitate, guys, to just go on the dedicated channel to ask your questions, and Kristal will reply to them. Thank you, Kristal.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Have a great
Bye.
night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. So for now, we will have a 10-minute break. Like after what we will just